Now, the rest of the story. I'm going to introduce you to a physician named Arthur, who might otherwise be referred to as Dr. Failure. Hard as he tried, he simply could not get the hang of the medical profession. Ordinarily, when one is just not suited to be a doctor, he or she will not make it through medical school. Arthur, however, had a keen mind. He did quite well in the academic side of medicine. It was after he had completed his education that his difficulties began. For example, in October of 1890, he traveled to Berlin. He'd heard of a Dr. Koch's claim to have discovered a cure for pulmonary tuberculosis. For weeks, Arthur learned all he could about lungs. Somehow it only inspired him to become an eye specialist. All right. A series of lectures on ophthalmology had been scheduled for the following January in Vienna. Arthur decided to attend. It was only after he got there, after he was sitting in the lecture hall, that British Arthur realized the lectures were in German. He could barely converse in German, much less understand the German words for sophisticated medical terms, so Arthur remained in Vienna for several weeks, learning how to ice skate. And when Arthur returned to England, he really earned the title of Dr. Failure. By now, it was late March 1891. Arthur rented a small apartment at number 23 Montague Place, London's Russell Square. The private office he chose was located only a few hundred yards away at number 2 Devonshire Place. For years, Arthur had looked forward to this private practice. His office's Devonshire Place address put him in the midst of London's most renowned, most respected physicians. Specialists whose names Arthur had known all of his life were now his neighbors. And as a doctor, Arthur felt certain he had arrived. So he hung out his shingle. He waited. Nobody came. That was the first day. After which Arthur went home and told his wife. Both had anticipated a slow going at first. They had known that it would take time to establish a new practice and to build the confidence of neighborhood patients. But the second day was like the first. Nobody visited Arthur's office, not a single patient. That evening, Arthur's wife asked if the plate with his name on it were clearly visible from the street. Well, Arthur checked and assured her that it was, his name and the designation of his practice, consulting oculist. Nobody who had passed that door could ignore the presence of an eye specialist. And yet it just seemed that nobody cared. Day in, day out, Arthur walked from his apartment to his office, arriving at 10 in the morning, remaining until 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and weeks went by, and still Arthur failed to attract a solitary patient. Arthur was Dr. Failure, almost as though he were destined to be disappointed in the field of medicine. Not one patient ever did knock on his office door, not one. But did I tell you how Arthur killed all that time while waiting for patients to show up? Well, he amused himself by writing. He turned what had been little more than a hobby into a full-time profession. What a shame for the literary world if Arthur had been a success as a physician, for he was Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's most famous creation, Sherlock Holmes, is a character that somehow jumped off the page and seemingly became real. The last time I was in London, I visited the Sherlock Holmes Museum at the famous address 221B Baker Street. Now, one of the things that stuck with me from that visit was a huge collection of letters from school children addressed not to Conan, but to Sherlock Holmes. They believed he was real. Most of us are unaware of Conan's work in the medical field. Dr. Failure is certainly a powerful nickname to be stuck with, but does Conan really deserve this title? Arthur Conan Doyle was born on May 22, 1859 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was the second of 10 children born to Charles and Mary Doyle. Conan's father struggled with alcoholism to the point that Conan and his 9 siblings were separated and scattered in temporary housing across Edinburgh. Conan went to live with the aunt of a friend. 3 years later, Conan and his siblings reunited with their parents, but they lived in a squalid tenement house. It was just filthy and nasty and broken down. Luckily, Conan's extended family took an interest in his and his siblings and helped pay for their education. From 1876 to 1881, Conan studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. While a medical student, Conan wrote short stories which he tried to sell to magazines. His earliest known work of fiction, The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, was turned down for publication. On September 6, 1879, Chambers' Edinburgh Journal published The Mystery of Sasassa Valley. It was Conan's first published piece. 2 weeks later, September the 20th, he published his first academic article entitled Gelsemium as a Poison in the British Medical Journal. 3 years into his medical training, 1880, Conan was the doctor on a whaling ship called Hope, which sailed into the Arctic. This is the model of the Hope. Shortly after departing, he wrote his mother, "You will be glad to hear that I never was more happy in my life. I've got a strong bohemian element in me, I'm afraid, and the life just seems to suit me." Conan often joined the crew on seal hunts on the ice. He wrote about one such occasion. "I had just killed a seal on a large piece of ice when I fell over the side. Nobody was near and the water was deadly cold. I had to hold on to the edge of the ice to prevent my sinking, but it was too smooth and slippery to climb up by until at last I got hold of the seal's hind flippers and managed to pull myself up by them." Now Conan had several mishaps, each of which could have taken his life. By the end of their voyage, Conan had earned the respect of every man on the ship, including its captain, who invited Conan to return on the next year's trip as a harpooner as well as surgeon. Conan later wrote, "It is well that I refused, for the life is dangerously fascinating." On August 10, 1880, just as the whaling ship had returned to Scotland, Conan wrote in his diary, "The lighthouse keeper came off with last week's Weekly Scotsman, by which we learned of the defeat in Afghanistan. Terrible news. I could barely believe my eyes when I read." 6 years later, Conan created a character of a British Army doctor who was seriously wounded in the Battle of Maiwand, the one he had written about in his diary. That character was Dr. John Watson. Conan returned to medical school and earned a bachelor's degree in medicine and qualified as a master of surgery in 1881. Conan was deeply impressed by the observational skills of one of his professors, Dr. Joseph Bell. Dr. Bell was unusually adept at observing the most minute details regarding a patient's condition, details that others would probably miss. Dr. Bell was Conan's inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. After completing his bachelor's degree, Conan served as ship's surgeon on the SS Mayumba during the voyage to the West African coast. In the following year, 1882, Conan and a former classmate named George Budd opened a medical practice in Plymouth, England. But Conan and George had a strained working relationship, and their partnership dissolved after only a few months. Conan set up his own independent medical practice in Portsmouth, England, where he treated a patient named Jack Hawkins. Now, while treating Jack, Conan met and, in 1885, married Jack's sister, Louise. In the same year, Conan earned his MD upon completing his thesis, an essay upon the vasomotor changes in tabes dorsalis. Now, tabes dorsalis is a form of neurosyphilis, which is a complication of late-stage syphilis infection. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that spreads sexually. When left untreated, the bacteria can damage the spinal cord and peripheral nervous tissue. This is tabes dorsalis. As Mr. Harvey explained, in March 1891, Conan opened an ophthalmologist medical practice here at what is now 2 Upper Wimpole Street in London. That address is marked by this plaque. No one came to see the eye specialist. So in his spare time he wrote, but did not create Sherlock Holmes because of the failed medical practice. He published his first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, in 1887, 4 years earlier. His second Sherlock Holmes novel, The Sign of the Four, was published in 1890. In 1891, while awaiting customers, Conan wrote 5 Sherlock Holmes short stories. In 1892, he wrote 6 more Sherlock Holmes short stories and wrote to Dr. Joseph Bell about Sherlock Holmes. It is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes. Round the center of deduction and inference and observation, which I have heard you inculcate, I have tried to build up a man. But Conan wrote much more than just Sherlock Holmes. He published more than 30 articles, short stories, and serialized novels before he published his first Sherlock Holmes story. Now that doesn't even include his published works in the medical field. By the time Conan opened his ophthalmologist practice, he was already tired of Sherlock Holmes. He wrote to his mother, "I think of slaying Holmes and winding him down for good and all. He takes my mind from better things." Conan's mother quickly wrote back, "You won't, you can't, you mustn't." Now, Conan wanted to be done with Sherlock Holmes. Rather than killing the character, he raised the price for his Sherlock Holmes stories to an amount that he thought was so high no publisher would pay. But he was wrong. His attempt to end Sherlock Holmes made him one of the highest paid authors at the time. In December 1893, Conan looked for another way to rid himself of his most famous character. In the short story entitled The Final Problem, Sherlock Holmes and his arch-enemy, Professor Moriarty, plunged to their deaths down the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. 7 years later, due to public outcry, Conan wrote what Sherlockians ranked as the best of the Holmes novels, The Hound of the Baskervilles. I'm sure you've heard of it. He explained in a follow-up short story that only Professor Moriarty had fallen to his death, but Holmes made it look as if he had died as well to evade his many enemies. On July the 7th, 1930, 71-year-old Sir Arthur Conan Doyle died of a heart attack. On Sunday night, July 14th, 1930, thousands of people crowded into the Royal Albert Hall in London for a spiritualist memorial service for Conan. Conan's second wife, Jean, his first wife, had died in 1906 of tuberculosis. Conan's second wife, Jean, sat on the stage. Next to her was an empty seat reserved for Conan. On the other side of the empty seat sat spiritualist Estelle Roberts, who claimed to be able to see and communicate with the dead. During the service, Estelle spoke to a quiet crowd who anxiously waited to hear a message from Conan. They were disappointed when Estelle whispered Conan's message in his widow's ear. That message has never been divulged. It's unfair for us to refer to Conan as Dr. Failure. You see, in 1902, Conan was knighted by King Edward VII, not for his fictional writings, but for his work as a doctor during the Boer War, where he treated soldiers during a typhoid epidemic. But rather than being a failed doctor, he was just more successful as an author. Remember, Conan himself said, "Sherlock Holmes takes my mind from better things." I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.